So you've just taken your bar exam and you're thinking maybe you failed, but you don't know. Stick around, and in this video I'll give you some benchmarks to help you make that determination before results come out. Some Google information the other day, going through keywords and search terms, and I noticed that one of the most common bar exam related search phrases on the internet said something to the effect, "How do I know if I failed my bar exam?" I thought that was a really interesting question, more than interesting, obviously profound question and deeply important question. And it got me to thinking, how do you know if you failed or passed your bar exam before the actual results come out? You know, in some jurisdictions like California or Georgia, it takes months and months after the test to get the results. And in other places, while it might only take as little as 6 weeks, that's still a very long time to be waiting, and it can be a troubling time for a lot of people. So I wanted to share with all of you my general thoughts about what you might take coming out of the bar exam and how you might interpret your results and your activity and what you experienced. Now, let me first say that I think that there are a group of people who chronically underpromise and overdeliver. You know what I mean? They're the people that are always sort of putting themselves down as if to say, oh, gee, I'm not really smart enough, I'm not talented enough, I'm not good enough. And then the results come out from school or wherever, and they're at the top of the class, or they got the best job, or whatever it might have been. And I think that these are genuinely modest, humble, self-effacing, self-deprecating kinds of people. And if you're thinking that you failed, but in all honesty, you know that you're one of those really successful people, the best advice I can give you right now is to just chill, relax, and know that you probably did pass. You know, if you're one of those kinds of folks, you probably didn't fail, and you know deep down that you probably didn't fail. But if you want to tell the rest of the world that that's what it feels like happened, well, so that when you pass, it will be maybe even a bigger accomplishment and a bigger achievement, well, then go for it. Nobody but you and I have to know that little secret. But, you know, that is not a majority of the people. In fact, it's a very small number of people, I think, that fit into that group. Instead, I think for the vast majority of people who take the test and come out of the exam, over the ensuing weeks, as they begin to get away from the test, they begin to do some post-mortem, some rethinking and evaluation. And I've taped some messages about post-mortems in other places, and we'll link to those so that you can watch them. But I wanted to talk about what kinds of things might help you inform that post-mortem as to whether or not you passed or failed the bar, and then what to do about it. So here are some things we historically see when someone has actually failed the bar. For example, on the multi-state exam, if you did not complete at least 190 questions out of the 200 that were given, even though the number that count is smaller than that. But in other words, if you left more than 5 questions in each section blank, or you bubbled them in at the end, or you Christmas treed them, or whatever you did, because you never actually got to the question, you literally didn't get to those, that is not a good sign. If you had difficulty in your practice before the exam doing practice multi-states, and you didn't get through 100 questions in the morning or 100 questions in the afternoon session, and you're only getting to 75, 80, 90, 95 of those questions in each session, and you did that on the bar exam, then I would say the odds are good that your multi-state score is probably not going to be high enough to pass in any jurisdiction. Now, every jurisdiction's scores are obviously different, but typically it's going to take anywhere from about 122 or 123 raw questions correct up to 130 or higher if you're in a jurisdiction like California for a passing score. So if your practice scores were nowhere near those numbers and you felt like you were guessing or ran out of time at the end, that is not a good sign, and it could be a sign of failing. Now, in some of the jurisdictions across the country, the bar examiners use something called an equi percentile or a compensatory model. For example, in a jurisdiction like Florida, you can actually pass the multi-state with a scaled 136 and bank that score. But in many places, most jurisdictions, in fact, a lower score on one part of the exam is offset by a higher score on the other. This is true in the 33 jurisdictions of the UBE, for example. So in and of itself, in most of these jurisdictions, just failing the multi-state, whatever 50% of the overall score is, would not be enough to fail the bar overall, unless your score is so low that it brings you down to a point where you can't bring it back over the top with your written work. So if you're just below the threshold on a UBE score where you need a 260 overall, that would be a 130 on the multi-state, and maybe you're getting 125 in practice, 127, 128. Well, that's not a reason to think that you're going to fail the bar. Now, if in addition to all of this, on the actual exam, you had trouble reading the questions, if you had trouble understanding the distinctions, if you were trying to memorize a lot of information, I think all of that puts you at a disadvantage on the MBE. And I would say that if that's the way you attack the exam and you felt like you had difficulty understanding the test and the questions and the law, and you didn't finish your exam, you should seriously consider the possibility that you didn't pass. And what do? Well, I think in that situation, you want to look at changing to a course, one like ours, for example, that uses release questions rather than made-up questions, like the Big Box Bar Review do. And you should look for and work on a course that gives you enough practice opportunities and enough learning opportunities that you can distill the multi-state into manageable pieces. We actually use a process called selective intuition for the bar exam, and the idea is to be able to intuitively answer the questions rather than wrestling and agonizing for minutes on end on a single question. And it's proven to be very, very successful. But I think for too many people, what happens is that they get into too much detail, too much depth. They try in their practice and on the exam to get into the subject in too much detail, and then on the multi-state example, they get bogged down on specific questions. And if that happened to you, that's not a good sign. Now, another benchmark that you can use is that if you have difficulty reading English and writing English, if English is not your first language and you had trouble getting through all the questions for that reason, truthfully, that is a bad sign given the overall pass rate for foreign attorneys. And you're probably going to need to work on your English level skills, and you probably didn't pass the bar. And most people in that circumstance know that to be the case. So I would say that if you are having difficulty with English, it's most likely that you did not do well on the exam. That's usually a defining factor of someone that fails. In addition, as I said, if you didn't do well on the multi-state in practice and you didn't finish the questions on the exam, that's also a pretty clear determinant of how you're doing or how you did on the test itself. If you had to guess on a lot of questions, then that could be problematic for you. But what if you had to guess on some of the multi-state? Well, that does not mean that you failed the exam. I would say that if you felt like you guessed on some questions, that's typically the way most people come out of the bar. And it's a criterion of a test that's built on fine line, small distinctions. But what you find ultimately is that the MBE is really consists of what I describe as repeatable principles. That is to say, once you've seen these principles and you are able to identify them, you see them tested over and over and over again. So if you're in a course that identifies that principle and you see it on the exam, you're going to be all right. If you didn't see those principles and you weren't aware of them, if you were really trying to build your test result on the basis of memorization and recitation of elements, that's probably not going to be very successful. Okay, so that's a little bit about the multi-state. Can you come out with a clear, definitive answer and say, I absolutely failed or absolutely passed? Well, for most people, the broad majority of people, they won't be able to say for sure. But if you fall into one of those extremes that we just talked about, then you probably have a better idea. What about the written part of the exam, the essays in particular? If you're in a jurisdiction, and most of them do offer essay tests, how do you know if you pass those or not? Well, again, we've got some basic benchmarks for you that we think you want to look at. First, the obvious one is, did you write an answer to every question? Now, that seems obvious, but there are people, because of timing problems, who never get to all the questions. They skip a question or they lose time. In a Texas exam where they've got an hour to do 2 questions, they spend 45 minutes on one. Or in the California exam where it's an hour for each question in a 3-hour block, and they spend over an hour and a half on each question. They get to the 3rd question, there's no time. You see the result of this. If you skipped an answer or wrote very little because of time considerations, the odds are very good that you failed that exam. Sad, but true. The second is, how much did you actually write on the essay? I mean, some people say, well, I got to all of them, but I didn't have much time and I couldn't say much. In general, when we're talking about 1-hour essays, the word count that I look for my students is about 1,100 to 1,500 words if you're typing in an hour's time. If you're in a 45-minute essay jurisdiction like Georgia, we're looking for about 800 to 1,000, maybe 1,100 words. If you're in a 30-minute jurisdiction like the UBE, it's cut down to more like 700 to 850 words typewritten. Now, what if you're a handwriter on the essays and the performance test? First of all, I think you have to ask yourself, was your writing legible on the test? And that's pretty critical. More and more these days, I find that bar examiners in all jurisdictions simply don't take the time to wade through illegible writing to try and decipher it, interpret it, and figure it out. We've come a long way from the days when we had law professors grading bar exams and they were used to seeing handwritten work. The truth is there are just too many pieces of paper, and there's too much to do in too short a time to do it, and most bar exams actually hire out graders based on and give them point sheets, and they just aren't going to take the time to wade through the writing. So the truth is, if your writing was not easily read, it's probably not going to be successful. Now, I do know that some of you take courses, bar review courses, where they say, that's okay, don't worry about your writing, just underline big important words, put the buzzwords or the terms of art in there, capitalize the important words, put arrows or blocks or circle the words and so on. If you are one of those people, I've got a really bad piece of news for you. That is a pure urban myth. It does not change or improve your bar results in the least. If you went into the exam and you thought that all you had to do was recite a bunch of buzzwords and make sure that that was legible, even if everything else was not, the odds are not in your favor. The examiners don't reward that behavior in any jurisdiction. Good writing, no matter what the jurisdiction is, has to communicate that you understood how to use the law, and if all you've done is to recite some memorized buzz terms, you haven't demonstrated that skill at all. And anyone that tells you differently, I think, is preying on the naivety of the bar-taking community. It's a shame. It shouldn't happen. And I want to make sure that you understand that that is not a way to success. So if that's something you did on your essays, I would say in general, you're probably in trouble. But what if you wrote a nice legible piece of writing, or you typed your answer, but you don't feel like you know, as one bar review says, you know the law cold in one or more of the subjects? Well, in general, I would say that that's not a criterion that would cause most people to fail. In fact, I would say if you asked all the bar takers that had to write their essays from the exam, did you know all of the law and all of the subjects, you would find very few people that would say, yes, I knew everything that was on the test. In fact, I think it's only the delusional few who actually claim to know all of the law. Most people who take the bar exam will have to make some reasonable guesses about the law in different subjects. And so, if that was your situation, if you felt that way, don't let that make you think that you failed the test. Now, if you had absolutely no idea what the law was at all in a question, I mean, not a single dispute or part of the question was answerable to you, and all you did was to try to spot some issues or throw out some legal buzzwords, well, that answer is probably going to get a below average or a failing score. And by itself, that's usually not enough to keep most people from failing. In other words, one bad essay is generally not enough to keep you from passing the exam. But if you also had problems on the multi-state, or if your handwriting was illegible, or if your answers were generally too short on the other essays, well, then you might be in trouble. What if you went into the essays and you thought you did reasonably well, but your plan was that you were going to spot issues and try and write as much as you possibly could? Well, I would say that issue spotters live a life of purgatory after the bar exam. And the reason is that you don't know which of your words, if any, made any difference at all. So as a result, you had to put more items on the paper, more words on the page, in the hopes that some of it would be right, some of it would be on point. Now, I think that's a very risky approach, and we've never taught or emphasized that approach in our course. Instead, what we suggest is that you write about what was in dispute or in conflict. That way, even if you didn't know the law, even if you didn't memorize the rules, you could write about how you would use the law to identify and make arguments. And that's the skill that lawyers are required to demonstrate. In our experience, if you do that, you probably passed. But if all you did was to memorize rules and then recite elements and you tried to spot issues, well, then you're on a fairly narrow plank there. And unless you've got a lot of words on the paper and you did an extraordinary job of getting a lot of information down for each and every question, the odds are against you for being successful on that part of the exam. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying every IRAC issue spotting writer will fail the bar. That's obviously not the case. But statistically, a substantial proportion, we would say in February bar exams, typically more than 50% of the bar takers, and in July, probably somewhere on the order of 30 to 40% of the bar takers who use that approach will not be successful. So, you want to keep this in mind in the broad context of the way you're writing and recognize that it could be problematic. And if you had trouble on the multi-state or other parts of the exam, well, the evidence begins to pile up on the negative side of the ledger. So, if you were an issue spotter and you were trying to memorize a lot and you recognized after the exam that you might have missed a lot of things that you probably didn't write about, everything that was important, that's not a great sign. It doesn't mean definitively that you failed, but it's something that I recognize you're not going to be very comfortable with. On the other hand, if you used an approach of writing about disputes and conflicts and you didn't know all the law on every topic, recognize that there's still a lot about the exam and a lot about the law that you did get right and did know, and that's what I would rely on and assume that you're at least still more likely to pass than to fail. Now, obviously, there's some other elements to the exams in different jurisdictions, like a performance test. This is obviously a major part of the exam on the UBE. It's also part of the exam in California. How important is it? Well, in general, I would say that the performance tests have significance these days, more than they used to in years past. And for many people, performance tests are unique enough that they really come out of the exam either feeling pretty good about their performance there or very poorly. I would say that in some cases it's a timing problem. In some cases it's an inability to understand what was being asked on the question, either in form or term. In general, what we recommend to our students is to identify the tone in the audience and then aim on a 90-minute performance test, which is the norm across the UBE and in California, to be looking at about 1,500 to 2,000 words typewritten. That's manageable. If you did that and you were in that word count and you used the law in the library and you applied it to the facts in the file, then the odds are that you're okay for that part of the exam. Now, will the performance test lift an otherwise failing exam into passing? No, it won't. Could it push an otherwise passing exam into failing? Well, it might if you're right on the edge, but most people aren't right on the edge. And so in general, I would say, don't try to evaluate your overall performance on the bar exam based on how you did on the performance tests by themselves. They're important, but they are not definitive in our experience. Well, what if you had to do another part of the exam, state multiple choice questions in Florida or the P&E in Texas? How important is that? Well, in Florida, the state multiple choice is very important now. The difficulty is that it's hard to get more than about half of those questions correct. And if you feel like you got a reasonable sense of the questions and you got through all of them and finished them, then again, my view is it's not enough probably to keep you from passing the exam, and you should feel okay with that. If you're in another state where there's something like the procedure and evidence or short answer questions, you've got to look at the relative weight that's given to that part of the exam. In Texas, P&E counts for 10% of your score. So unless your score is right on the edge from everything else, the P&E by itself typically isn't enough to be determinative again. Now, if you feel like you did really well on any of these sections, that's a good sign. And it's a good thing. But again, it's not enough to raise a bad result elsewhere. So if you feel like you did poorly on the multi-state and you had a lot of trouble with your essays, but you did well on the state multiple choice, or you feel like you did well on the performance tests, I would say in general, that is usually not enough to raise a bad score and to make it a passing score. I think another problem that a lot of people deal with in this post-bar period is that their friends come out of the exam and they tell you that they had seen issues X, Y, and Z, but you didn't recall seeing any of those. Well, here's what I want to reassure you about. That kind of postmortem is meaningless. It does not mean that you passed or you failed. It might mean you've got brilliant friends, or it might mean that your friends are frankly not so smart. It has no bearing, however, on whether you passed or failed, and you should avoid that conversation at all costs. Just shut it down, walk away, talk to the hand, whatever you got to do, but literally cut those people off. You don't need to have that conversation. Now, having said all that, what do you do if you've done this more objective analysis of your performance? You've looked at how you did on the multi-state answering the questions, your pre-test performance there. You look at your essays and how well you got them written and how closely identified you were able to get through all the fact patterns. You look at your timing and your word count. You look at your performance tests, again, for timing and word count, for the ability to follow the directions. If all of that analysis for you leads you to conclude on whole that you did not pass the exam, what do you do now? Well, I would say one of the best things to start doing right now is to explore alternatives before you get the results. It's very hard to make a decision in those first few hours after you get the results, but time is not your ally here, and you want to be ready to make a decision and move forward if the results were not favorable. I would also think very long and hard, if you don't pass the exam, about what you can do differently next time than you did before. And one of those keys might be to start studying earlier. Another might be to use a tool like photo reading to improve your reading speed and comprehension. It might be to use an approach like our selective intuition on the multi-state. The point is, find an approach that will be different than what you did before. Now, this idea of starting your studies earlier is something I want to explore a little bit more, because by and large, most people don't give themselves enough time to study. And in our view, what you want to have is about 250 to 300 hours of study time. So if you need to balance that out over a longer period of time by starting early, we would definitely encourage you to do that. I would also say that if you had trouble with your writing on the bar exam, and if the results come out that way, and if it's your sense that that's your problem, this is the time to look at courses where you have the option of personalized writing assistance. And I mean by that the kind of writing assistance that comes from someone who actually knows how to teach writing and teach the bar exam, and not the kind of writing assistance from an anonymous grader, someone who's typically struggling to find a law-related job, and they've agreed to grade essays for $10 a shot on Craigslist, and believe it or not, those ads are up every week. That is not good teaching, and if that's all you're getting, then no matter what you paid for your bar review, you're overpaying for it. I would say you're much better off to find a course like ours, where you've got an idea as to who the teacher is, someone who actually knows how to teach writing, has been doing it for a long time, and you can get personalized feedback on your work. You know what I hate the most is to see people come into the course and then make the same errors over and over again. I have people who come to me who failed an exam multiple times before, and they come and say, well, I don't want to invest in a mentored course. I don't want any review of my work. I'm just going to get your materials. Well, there's a lot of information in our materials, including writing direction and guidance, and it'll help. It'll improve your scores, and for many people, it will help them pass. But the really best way to ensure that you get the result you want is to get feedback on your work. Now, I know lots of people don't want feedback on their written work. It's painful, it's hard to hear. And while you may have heard that I'm an extremely difficult person, that's actually not true. I try to be pretty gentle with that criticism in the sense that I want to help you improve your work and not beat you down. So the point is that knowing how to teach writing is a skill. It's not something that you just throw out and say, well, I give you a score of X and here's what you did wrong. It's a little bit more to it than that. But you know, this is really how you improve, by having a conversation about your work. And that's why we do writing conferences that are on video, and we record them and send them back to you so you've got the opportunity to go back and replay them for yourself later. Now, if you turned out to have problems on the multi-state exam, then I think the same wisdom applies here. You need to get into a course that will take you through a systemic way of studying for those questions using licensed bar exam questions and good answer explanations. You need more than a computer program or just random questions. You know, it's not just the questions, it's the answer explanations that are important here. And for over 30 years, we've been developing our answer questions and answers so that you've got the ability to have real clear guidance on why answer A is right and answer B is wrong, or whatever it might be. I think you also want to have a course that will help you structure your study, that will give you a list of assignments, a study guide, a way to go through it within a given timeline and a time frame, but it's flexible enough to meet your needs. That is, not everyone has to study the same subject at the same time on the same day. All of those things, in our experience, make a big difference in the outcome. But if all you do is go back and repeat what you've done before, doing it the same way you did it before, studying the same way for the same time with the same tools, the odds are, as you know, that you won't be successful on the exam. You'll get the same result over and over again. So, if when you get your results, if they're not successful, you have my empathy and condolences. But it's time to get back to work. It's time to show you how to make the next bar exam, your last bar exam. And I'd invite you to contact me, whether you took our course or not, and I'd be glad to talk with you about your results and about what could be done differently and about some things you might consider going forward. If you got your results and you passed, congratulations. That's a great result. Feel good about it. Know that it's over and done, and go be a kind and gentle member of our profession. But for right now, if you're worried about passing and you're not sure whether or not you passed or failed the exam, and you want to talk with us beforehand, give us a call. You can use the link below to schedule a conference, and I'd be glad to talk with you and give you my opinion and feelings about how you did on the exam. But I really hope that this video gives many of you some guidelines and some principles that you can apply as you think about your test and how you did on the exam itself. I would say that the best advice anyone can give you at this time is to try and be at peace with what's happening. The scoring is not up to you, it's up to the examiners. The results will eventually come out, and when they come out, we hope that they're favorable to you. But if they're not, we don't want you to give up or lose hope. There is a way for you to pass the exam, and we're anxious to share that with you.